One of the most horrific crimes against humankind took place long before the outbreak of World War II in the Chinese city of Nanjing. The prelude to this tragedy was the Japan-China War that began on July 7, 1937. The Chinese army, led by Chiang Kai-shek, was inferior to the Japanese in both training and weaponry. Thus, despite the army's resistance, the Japanese first seized Beijing, then with great losses, Shanghai, and in early December the Japanese army was already on the outskirts of the capital of the People's Republic of China, Nanjing. This is X-War History Channel. Let's begin. Chiang Kai-shek decided not to defend the city, so the army under his leadership from December 12 undertook a retreat, which actually turned into a flight. In order not to hinder the army, all possible obstacles were created for the evacuation of civilians from Nanjing. Soldiers demolished boats and blocked the movements of refugees. This also led to a bloody tragedy that later took place. The beginning of massacre. As early as December 13, 1937, Japanese troops broke into Nanjing. Then began something that, strange as it may sound, was even reported to Hitler, the unparalleled brutality of the Ally on the Berlin-Rome-Tokyo alliance. From the first day of their conquest of the city, the Japanese began not just a simple terror, but a massive extermination of the population. Later, after the war, some historians explained what happened in this way. The point of all of Japan's actions at the time was to take over China and bring to power a government under their control. The Nanjing murders can therefore be seen as a sign of intimidation. The Japanese troops planned to crush the resistance of the Chinese, to weaken their spirit. So what exactly happened? Even today, it is simply impossible to talk about many things because it causes horror and downright disgust. The first massacre took place on the banks of the Yangtze River. Chinese POWs and men of draft age were tied up, lined up in columns of 4, and machine-gunned. Survivors were finished off with bayonets. On this day, according to some estimates, about 57,500 people were executed. The next mass execution took place at the Taiping Gate a few days later. About 1,300 Chinese were blown up on mines. Then the survivors were bayoneted to death and their bodies were set on fire. As a matter of fact, the Japanese press of that time was full of praise for 2 officers, Lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, who staged a competition to see who would be the first to chop off 100 heads in one day. However, on the very first day, both of them credited 104 and 105 victims, respectively. Then the officers decided to raise the bar, bringing the number of executed to 150 a day. Not only did the Japanese publications Osaka Mainichi Shimbun and Tokyo Nichi Shimbun write about the contest, but a photo of the heroes during the contest was published on the cover of the Osaka Mainichi Shimbun, and some articles were even translated into English. It must be said here that after the end of the World War II, the 2 executioners were tried before a military tribunal and received a fairly legitimate sentence for their crimes in Nanjing, the death penalty. Though thousands of other criminals remained without punishment. After all, if there are still some documents about the facts of the execution of prisoners of war, then about the atrocities against simple civilians, there are only the memories of miraculously surviving eyewitnesses. Crimes against civilians. First off, the Japanese military practically raped all women and girls from 10 to 60 years of age. A particularly gruesome fate awaited pregnant women who were abused as best they could, ranging from violence to torture in such a way that the unfortunate woman lost her child and died in terrible agony. Some had their internal organs cut out. Men were castrated in large numbers, and they were beaten to death. Burying people alive and also burning them alive were commonplace. Crucifixions on gates and doors were actively practiced. By the way, several thousand of the victims of that massacre were suicides. Women who survived several tens of rapes simply could not endure such loss of dignity and ended their lives by suicide afterwards. In addition, Japanese soldiers forced sons to rape their own mothers and fathers to rape their daughters. According to some estimates, 20,000 to 80,000 people suffered from all kinds of violence alone, including insults under threat of death. The Japanese also liked to bury unfortunate people waist deep in the ground and set German shepherds on them. One of the documentators of the crimes, Iris Chan, an American writer of Chinese descent, has collected more than 1,000 testimonies, the most incredible of which is the following. More devilish tortures were practiced, such as hanging people by their tongues on iron hooks, or burying people waist deep and watching them being torn apart by German shepherds. The whole scene was so disgusting that, even the Nazis who were in town were disturbed. According to accounts of eyewitnesses, the streets of Nanjing were simply filled with bodies, many bearing the marks of hideous torture and broken bottles, knives, and swords. Zone of safety. Most strikingly, it was thanks to the Germans that a large part of the Chinese population managed to somehow escape. The German businessman Rabe organized the so-called Nanjing Security Zone, where citizens of other countries lived and, by mutual agreement, the Japanese went around. Thanks to the created zone of safety, it was possible to hide and protect from the Japanese about 200,000 Chinese. About 700 more Rabe placed under the roof of his house. This is one of many memories. My uncle and his children took refuge in the safety zone, and when I lost my home, they took me there too. The end of the massacre and the punishment of the guilty. The massacre continued for about 6 weeks until a collaborationist government was formed. Only after its creation did the violence begin to decline. It should be noted that the Japanese General Ivan Matsui, who did not command the capture of Nanjing because of illness, was also horrified by what was happening in Nanjing. But after his recovery, however, he was unable to stop the massacre despite many attempts. Certain speculations suggest that the massacre was ordered by Prince Sasaki Yasuhiko, the commander of the Japanese armed forces in China. According to various estimates, about 400,000 people were killed during the Nanjing massacre. By the way, the backlash from the crime was such that Prince Sasaki Yasuhiko was sent back to Tokyo, and the innocent General Ivan Matsui was retired. After the war, during the so-called Tokyo trial in the year 1946, only a few dozen officers were sentenced to death, many of whom committed suicide even before the sentence was carried out. It is surprising that General Ivan Matsui was also sentenced to death. The prince, on the other hand, was not even brought to trial as a member of the imperial family, who had received immunity under the terms of the capitulation. Rabe's fate. When Rabe returned to Berlin, he tried to bring public attention to Japan's crimes in China, and even wrote an appeal to Hitler himself, asking the Führer to reassure his slightly inadequate ally. As a proof, Rabe provided a film recording he had made. Unfortunately, the businessman's advice was not taken into account. He himself was arrested by the Gestapo as a Chinese spy. The film was confiscated from Rabe, and he was forbidden to talk about what he had seen. After the war, Rabe was arrested by the Soviets, but was soon released. He was later arrested by the British, who also released him after an inspection. Despite his highly appreciated humanitarian services, Rabe, as a member of the Nazi Party, could not find a decent job and died in poverty. By the way, in the 21st century, classified American intelligence data was discovered, indicating that the total number of victims of the Nanjing massacre was 500,000 people. Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe to X War History to get notified when new videos come out, and also leave a like.